I jolted awake in the dead of night to the sound of my front door rattling violently, as if someone was trying to kick it clean off its hinges. At first, I thought it was just a vivid dream until a second, deafening thud made the picture frames in my hallway tremble. Before I could even swing my legs out of bed, a third blow hit, and that's when my dogs decided the night's entertainment had arrived. 2 German shepherds and 1 fearless rescue mutt launched down the hallway, nails clicking on the hardwood like a cavalry charge, barking with the kind of zeal usually reserved for chasing burglars or squirrels. By the time I grabbed my robe and reached the foyer, the dogs were already pressed against the door, their growls low and menacing, an unmistakable warning that they meant business. Through the small upper window of the door stood none other than Karen from the HOA, clad in pink satin pajamas, hair defying gravity and decency alike, her face twisted in self-righteous outrage. I cracked the door just enough to talk, keeping the chain in place, not for safety so much as for the comedic effect of watching her try to peer around it while avoiding 3 snapping sets of teeth. She was shouting about a violation, apparently unfazed by the hour or the canine chorus. She jabbed a finger toward my driveway, accusing me of parking illegally. Glancing past her, I saw my truck exactly where it always was, squarely in my driveway, perfectly legal, and blocking nothing but her peace of mind. I suggested it must be exhausting to wage war against imaginary crimes, which didn't seem to improve her mood. She demanded I move it immediately, as though she had the authority to enforce some neighborhood curfew of her own invention. The dogs lunged at the gap, barking so fiercely that she took a reflexive step back, still pointing but losing steam. I told her I'd happily discuss it with the HOA during daylight hours, but unless this was a true emergency, I was going back to bed. When she tried wedging her slipper into the door, the dog's barking forced her to retreat to the edge of the porch. From there, she launched into a speech about property values and community standards, though she couldn't keep her eyes off the pack, practically vibrating with the urge to make her night worse. I closed the door mid-randa, partly because I'd had enough, partly because I wanted to see if she'd keep going from the safety of the sidewalk. Sure enough, through the curtain I watched her stomp to the end of my driveway, whip out her phone, and snap photos like a tabloid reporter catching a scandal. I thought that would be the end of Ita until half an hour later, the dogs erupted again. This time, Karen was back with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across my lawn like she was hunting for buried treasure. I stepped outside before the dogs woke the entire block and asked if she was lost or auditioning for a low-budget crime drama. She waved a sheet of hot pink paper at me, calling it a notice of immediate action from the HOA board. I refused to take it, doubting any official HOA business was printed on neon paper at 3 in the morning. She claimed the board had voted to fine me on the spot and that my defiance would lead to serious consequences. I told her that was fine so long as she could explain to a judge why she was trespassing on my property in the middle of the night to deliver it. That seemed to throw her off. She muttered about calling the sheriff, and I cheerfully offered to make him coffee when he arrived. Realizing I wasn't going to fold, she stomped off again, flashlight jerking wildly as she left. The night settled back into quiet, and the dogs curled up by the front door, tails thumping lazily against the floor. I knew this wasn't the end. Karen never left things unfinished, but I didn't expect her next move so soon. Just before dawn, the crunch of gravel woke me again. Peering out the window, I spotted Karen's car creeping down my driveway with the headlights off like she was on a covert mission. I caught her halfway up my lawn, phone raised toward my porch. She froze at first, but instead of retreating, she doubled down, shouting that my landscaping lights violated the HOA's brightness policy. I reminded her they'd been there for 2 years without complaint, but she snapped back that new regulations had been passed apparently between her midnight visit and this early morning stakeout. I told her to put it in writing during daylight hours like a reasonable human, but right now, she was trespassing again. She gave a sharp, brittle laugh and claimed the HOA rules allowed board members to inspect properties at any time. I asked her to show me the rule, knowing full well it didn't exist. When she stalled, I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. That was enough to get her moving toward her car, tossing one last vague threat about bigger issues I'd soon face. The way she slammed her door told me I'd won this round, but as she drove off, I realized 2 things. Karen was escalating faster than I'd anticipated, and I was going to have to decide just how far I was willing to let this go. I decided it was only a matter of time before I stopped playing defense and started pushing back. If there's one thing I'd learned about Karen, it's that she thrived on people who stayed quiet. The next morning, my wake-up call wasn't sunshine or the smell of coffee, it was the dogs losing their minds again. Considering the chaos from the night before, I assumed they were barking at a stray leaf fluttering across the lawn, but stepping onto the porch revealed a new brand of ridiculous. My truck sat exactly where it belonged in my driveway, but now, plastered across the windshield, was a blindingly bright orange sticker, the kind you usually see on abandoned cars and impound lots. It read, "HOA violation A subject to towing." In tiny print, it claimed the offense was non-compliance with community vehicle placement guidelines. Apparently, my crime was existing while Karen was in a mood. I peeled the sticker off in one satisfying rip and scanned the street. There she was, standing at the edge of her driveway, clutching a clipboard like it was the Declaration of Independence, staring at me with smugness thick enough to spread on toast. She didn't wave or speak, just stood there like some spectral Victorian ant waiting to be acknowledged. I gave her a slow, mocking salute and went inside. I'd barely started brewing coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a county number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was a code enforcement officer, informing me that someone had filed a formal complaint about my vehicle blocking safe egress from the sidewalk. I almost laughed out loud. My driveway doesn't even touch the sidewalk as there's a strip of grass between them. The officer's tone hinted he knew this was nonsense, but protocol meant he had to check. By mid-morning, a small county truck pulled up and a polite officer stepped out. He glanced at my driveway, then at me, and asked if I knew a Karen. I simply pointed toward her house. She was outside again, pretending to sweep her immaculate walkway. The officer sighed like a man who'd been through this rodeo before, took a couple of photos, and confirmed there was no violation. Almost conspiratorially, he mentioned she'd filed 5 similar complaints against other neighbors and just the last 2 weeks all dismissed. I was apparently just the latest contestant in her little game. I figured that would end the morning drama until I spotted movement outside just before lunch. Karen was marching up my driveway, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She slapped a folded letter on my porch railing as the dogs positioned themselves like my personal security team. I asked if this was another middle-of-the-night emergency. Ignoring the jab, she announced that the HOA had voted to fine me $250 for vehicle obstruction and that I had 7 days to pay or face more penalties. I asked to see the meeting minutes, since HOA votes have to be documented. She claimed the minutes were confidential, which is not how any of this works. One board member shifted uncomfortably and muttered about needing to get to work. The other mumbled a quick goodbye and followed him. Karen stayed, leaning in slightly to inform me she'd be keeping an eye on my property until the matter was resolved. I told her that was fine as long as she understood that stepping onto my property without permission would mean I'd be keeping an eye on her from a courtroom. She huffed, spun around, and stomped off. I thought that might be the day's final act of absurdity. Wrong again. When I returned from errands that afternoon, there was a tow truck parked in front of my house. The driver stood beside my truck, scratching his head, while Karen hovered nearby, pointing at her clipboard like she was directing a crime scene. I parked behind the tow truck and asked what was going on. The driver explained he'd been told to tow my vehicle for violating community bylaws at the HOA's request. The work order had only one signature, Karen's. I made it clear, in front of both of them, that the HOA has zero authority to remove a vehicle from a private driveway without a court order or police instruction. Realizing he'd been dragged into a personal vendetta, the driver handed me the clipboard and decided to leave. Karen shouted after him that she'd be reporting his refusal to the board. He answered with nothing but a casual wave as he drove off. It should have felt like a win, but Karen wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of everything in my truck, my mailbox, the porch, anything she might spin into her next fabricated complaint. I ignored her and went inside. Later, when I checked the security footage, I saw she'd loitered for another 15 minutes, pacing the property line like a restless vulture. At that point, it was obvious that this wasn't about my truck anymore. It was about control, and she hated that I wasn't giving her any. The rest of the day was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet you get in a chess game when you know your opponent is already planning their next move. Exposing her lack of authority had clearly rattled her, but I knew she'd try to claw back control. My plan was to make sure her next move would be one she'd regret. That chance came sooner than expected. I was halfway through grilling dinner when I saw her marching up my driveway again, this time flanked by 2 uniformed security officers from the HOA's private patrol service. They weren't law enforcement, but the knockoff uniforms were designed to look just convincing enough from a distance. Karen pointed at my truck and ordered them to document the obstruction. One of the guards gave me an apologetic look and asked if the vehicle was mine. I confirmed it was and that it was parked on my private property. He nodded, snapped a quick picture, and muttered, "Sorry, she's persistent," before walking away. The other guard just shrugged and followed him. Karen lingered, glaring at me like I'd robbed her of something. She told me this was my last chance to comply before she took serious measures. I asked if those measures involved pounding on my door at another ungodly hour, because if so, the dogs were looking forward to it. She sputtered something about taking it higher before storming off. Every interaction was more leverage for me, another entry in my growing file of documented harassment. That night, Pete texted to say he'd spotted Karen loading file boxes into her car. Not moving boxes of file boxes, crammed with paperwork. That told me she was combing through HOA records for some obscure clause she could weaponize. It also told me she was nervous. People like her only scramble like that when they feel control slipping. I decided to push a little. I sent an anonymous note to a few neighbors suggesting they request an audit of recent HOA fines and expenses. Nothing inflammatory, just a friendly, "Hey, maybe we should make sure everything's above board." Within an hour, Pete told me the neighborhood group chat was blowing up with questions about how fines were decided and where the money was going. Karina, who normally dominated that chat, went silent. I slept better that night than I had in a week, not because I thought it was over, but because I knew this was just the eye of the storm. Karen wasn't a retreat and lick her wounds type, she was a double down type. And when she swung again, I wanted her to miss so badly the whole block would see it. The next morning, I spotted her counterattack. Taped to my front door was a fresh notice, this one printed in glaring red with final warning splashed across the top. Beneath was a wall of legal-sounding nonsense about escalating violations and mandatory corrective actions. The kicker, at the bottom it claimed, failure to comply within 48 hours will result in HOA-initiated property access for remediation. Translation: she was threatening to come onto my property herself and fix whatever she thought was wrong. The dogs must have sensed my blood pressure spike, because they pressed against my leg like they were ready to greet any uninvited visitors. I took the notice inside and added it to the growing Karen archive right next to the hot pink 3 a.m. warning and the fluorescent orange windshield sticker. Instead of confronting her immediately, I made 2 calls. First was to the sheriff's office, explaining the situation and asking them to document the threat of unlawful entry. The deputy knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, Karen's reputation extended beyond our street and assured me they'd send someone if she tried anything. The second call was to my lawyer, practical man, not prone to theatrics, but when I read him the final warning word for word, he actually laughed. He told me to let her try. It would cost her more in legal fees than any fine she could dream up. I didn't have to wait long. Around midday, Karen rolled down the street in a little convoy, her car in front, 2 other HOA board members behind, and trailing them a white pickup loaded with yard tools, garbage bags, and a gas-powered trimmer. They parked at the curb, and Karen strutted up the driveway in a wide-brimmed sun hat like she was Grand Marshal of a landscaping parade. One board member wore the look of a man wishing he were anywhere else. The other had that eager-to-please expression of someone desperate to stay in her good graces. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and asked if they'd gotten lost. Karen, loud enough for every neighbor within earshot, declared that the HOA had determined my property was in breach of community aesthetic guidelines and that they were here to correct the issues on my behalf. I told her plainly they were trespassing and that the sheriff was already aware. She scoffed and waved the red notice in the air like a royal proclamation. One of the board members glanced toward the street, clearly debating whether to bolt. One of the board members glanced toward the street like he was silently wishing a patrol car would appear and bail him out of the awkward scene. As soon as they stepped toward my yard, the dogs burst out in a chorus of barking, as if they'd been rehearsing for this moment their whole lives. Karen flinched but tried to mask it, demanding I restrain my animals so her team could get to work. I didn't budge. Instead, I strolled down the steps and positioned myself squarely between them and my lawn. Calmly, I asked if she could point out the exact bylaw that allowed her to enter my property without permission. She shuffled through the papers on her clipboard like the answer might magically appear, then snapped that she didn't owe any explanation to a non-compliant homeowner. That's when the sheriff's deputy arrived. He took his time stepping out, surveying the scene before asking what the problem was. Karen launched into a dramatic monologue about repeated violations and plummeting property values, waving in the direction of my perfectly tidy yard as if it were a junkyard. The deputy let her ramble until she ran out of steam, then turned to me and asked if I wanted them gone. I said yes. Without missing a beat, he told Karen and her crew they had zero legal grounds to be on my property without a court order, and that showing up again without my consent could earn them trespassing charges. Her face turned the same shade of red as that final warning notice she left earlier. She tried to argue, but the deputy shut her down, advising her to file a civil complaint if she really believed she had a case. Otherwise, she needed to leave. The caravan retreated, Karen's tires squealing as she sped off. I figured she'd sulk for the rest of the day. I was wrong. That evening, unfamiliar cars began appearing in the neighborhood. By 8 p.m., Pete texted me, "Karen's hosting some kind of meeting in her garage." I checked my security cameras and saw people streaming in, sitting in neat rows of folding chairs facing a projector screen. I could only imagine her evidencia, probably a slideshow of my driveway from every angle. An hour later, Pete messaged again, "She's telling people you're a danger to the community." That's when I decided to offer a little counter-programming. I quickly compiled a PDF containing the sheriff's incident report from earlier, the relevant HOA bylaws, and a few well-chosen security camera stills of Karen trespassing on my lawn with tools in hand. I sent it anonymously to a few neighbors who were still undecided about her. Within 15 minutes, my phone buzzed with messages from people laughing and sharing the files. By morning, I knew her garage campaign had lost steam. But Karen wasn't just stubborn, as she was running out of options, and desperate people make big mistakes. The next afternoon, I caught her creeping along the side of my house, holding her phone high, clearly trying to film through my windows. I stepped outside before she could get closer, and she jumped like I'd caught her pickpocketing. She muttered something about documenting hazards and hurried off. I didn't bother chasing her. My cameras caught everything. That night, I called my lawyer again. We went over the pattern of harassment, the trespassing, and the bogus fines. He suggested sending a cease and desist, but I had a better plan: let her keep overstepping until even her staunchest supporters couldn't defend her. Then, at just the right moment, I dump all the evidencia, photos, videos, recordings, and official reports into the laps of the entire HOA. Over the next 2 days, Karen practically worked for me. She left a neon notice on my door about my mailbox not matching neighborhood-approved paint colors. She staged a bizarre lawn inspection from across the street, narrating into her phone like she was filming a wildlife documentary. She even stopped the mail carrier to demand a mailbox measurement. Every stunt went straight into my growing evidence file. Saturday morning dawned calm and sunny, the kind of day most people spend relaxing. Karen, naturally, decided to escalate. By 9 a.m., she was striding down the street in a crisp white blouse, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard stuffed to bursting. 3 HOA board members trailed behind her, clearly roped into her scheme. Watching them approach, I felt the same rush I used to get before a big chess match. I already knew how this would end. I stepped onto the porch before she could knock, coffee in hand, and asked if this was another one of her emergency inspections. She didn't smile. In a voice loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear, she declared that the HOA had officially voted to begin corrective property action against me, a vague phrase designed to sound intimidating. I just as loudly asked if that vote was documented in the official minutes. She hesitated for half a second before saying the minutes weren't available to the public yet. The pause didn't go unnoticed. Right on cue, Pete wandered over with his phone out, pretending to check a text. "What's going on?" he asked, feigning innocence. Karen puffed up and rattled off my supposed violations: a blocked driveway sightlanes, improper lawn edging, and my personal favorite, failure to match community mailbox paint standards. Pete glanced at my mailbox, then back at her, and said, "Looks fine to me," in a tone that made a couple of neighbors snicker. I silently wished a police cruiser would appear to end the awkward standoff, but as soon as they stepped toward my lawn, my dogs exploded into a frenzy of barking, as if they'd been rehearsing for this exact showdown. Karen flinched but quickly put on her and control face, telling me to restrain my animals so her team could proceed. I didn't budge. Instead, I walked down the porch steps and placed myself squarely between them and my yard. Calmly, I asked her to point out the exact bylaw that allowed her to enter my property without my consent. She froze for a second, flipping through her clipboard as if the answer might magically appear, then snapped that she didn't have to explain herself to a non-compliant owner. That's when a sheriff's deputy rolled up. He stepped out slowly, scanning the scene before asking what was going on. Karen immediately launched into a speech about repeat violations and plummeting property values, gesturing dramatically toward my immaculate lawn and clean driveway as though they were proof of neighborhood decline. The deputy let her ramble until she ran out of steam, then turned to me and asked if I wanted them removed. I said yes. In a steady, no-nonsense tone, the deputy told Karen and her crew they had zero legal authority to be on my property without a court order and warned that returning uninvited could result in trespassing charges. Her face flushed a deep red, the exact shade of her final warning notices. She tried to argue, but the deputy cut her off, suggesting she could file a civil complaint if she truly believed she had a case. Otherwise, she needed to leave. The caravan departed in a cloud of frustration, Karen's tires squealing as she turned onto the main road. I assumed that would be the end of her antics for the day. I was wrong. That evening, unfamiliar cars appeared around the neighborhood. At 8 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Pete. "Karen's hosting a full-on meeting in her garage." Checking my security cameras, I saw neighbors filing into her open garage, where folding chairs were set up facing a projector screen. I could only imagine her presentation of probably a greatest hits reel of my driveway from every possible angle. An hour later, Pete texted again, "She's telling everyone you're a danger to the community." That's when I decided to run my own public awareness campaign. I compiled a PDF containing the sheriff's incident report from earlier, the relevant HOA bylaws, and a few choice stills from my cameras showing Karen trespassing with yard tools in hand. Then I sent it anonymously to a handful of undecided neighbors. Within 15 minutes, my phone lit up with messages, some laughing, others asking if I'd seen the evidence. Word traveled quickly, and I knew her little rally wouldn't survive the night. But Karen wasn't just stubborn, she was desperate. The next day, I caught her sneaking along the side of my house, holding her phone high, clearly trying to record through my windows. I stepped outside before she got too close. She jumped back, muttered something about documenting hazards, and speed-walked away. I didn't follow. My cameras caught everything. I knew she'd just handed me more ammunition. That night, I called my lawyer again. We went over the harassment pattern, trespassing incidents, and bogus fines. He suggested sending a formal cease and desist. I had a different plan: to let her keep overstepping until even her staunchest supporters couldn't defend her, then release everything at once. Over the next 2 days, she didn't disappoint. Another neon notice appeared on my door, this time accusing me of failing to maintain mailbox paint consistency with the neighborhood palette. She staged a bizarre lawn inspection from across the street, narrating into her phone like she was filming a wildlife documentary. She even stopped the mail carrier to demand they confirm my mailbox measurements. Every stunt went straight into my archive. By Saturday morning, the air was calm and sunny, the kind of day when normal people think about coffee and yard work. Karen thought about war. At 9 a.m., she marched down the street in a crisp white blouse, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard so stuffed with papers it looked ready to burst. 3 HOA board members followed like reluctant foot soldiers. The sight reminded me of a chess match. This was the final game, and I already knew the end. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and asked if she was here for another emergency inspection. Her lips were tight as she loudly declared that the HOA had officially voted to begin corrective property action against me, a phrase designed to sound threatening while meaning nothing. I asked, just as loudly, if that vote was recorded in the official meeting minutes. She hesitated, then claimed the minutes weren't available to the public yet. Neighbors nearby noticed the pause. Right on cue, Pete wandered over, pretending to check his phone. "What's going on?" he asked, playing dumb. Karen rattled off a list of alleged violations: obstructed driveway side lanes, non-regulation lawn edging, and my personal favorite, failure to conform to community mailbox paint standards. Pete glanced at my mailbox, then back at her, and said, "Looks fine to me," with just enough dry humor to make a few neighbors chuckle. Her jaw tightened. She ordered one of the board members to document the obstruction, but the guy took a half-hearted photo of my driveway and mumbled about needing to get to work. That's when I made my move. I went inside and returned with my neatly organized Karen file, a binder packed with every bogus notice she'd issued, screenshots from my cameras, sheriff's reports, and printed excerpts from the HOA bylaws. I handed copies to the neighbors, pointing out the sections that explicitly banned unauthorized entry and fines without a proper vote. Karen's voice rose, trying to talk over me, accusing me of twisting the bylaws. But the more she spoke, the more she sounded like someone unused to being challenged. Then I revealed my ace, a USB stick. I announced that at the next HOA general meeting, I'd present a short video featuring security footage synced with sheriff's reports, showing every instance of her trespassing and harassing. My tone was almost cheerful, like I was promoting a bake sale. The reaction was instant. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Neighbors raised eyebrows. Karen's lips pressed into a thin, pale line. She tried to spin it as a matter of community safety, but people had already started whispering, and once that doubt sets in, the illusion of authority collapses fast. Karen didn't retreat. She doubled down. When the home meeting arrived, the place was packed, normally a dull event of budget updates and landscaping bids, but that night, everyone was there for the video. Karen sat at the front, blazer on, commanding the room as usual. She opened with her agenda, then shifted to disciplinary matters for chronic violators. When resident comments opened, I stood. The room went quiet. I said I had evidence relevant to recent enforcement actions and asked to share it for transparency. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, but a couple likely tired of her crusades nodded. I plugged in the USB and pressed play. Crystal clear footage filled the screen at Karen posting neon notices under cover of night, creeping through my hedges with a tape measure, peering into windows, showing up with yard tools and unwilling board members, even calling a tow truck for a perfectly legal vehicle. Each clip was stamped with the matching sheriff's incident number. I didn't narrate, I didn't need to. By the time the last clip rolled showing the deputy ordering her off my property, the murmurs had turned into low laughter. Not cruel, but the kind that says, "We've been letting this person run the show." When the lights came back on, Karen tried damage control, claiming context was missing and that I was undermining the community. But no one was buying it, not even her two most loyal board allies, who stared at the table like they wished they were elsewhere. Then came the unplanned final blow. Mrs. Franklin, a retired attorney, stood up and calmly stated that, per the bylaws and evidence shown, Karen's actions could qualify as harassment and abuse of authority. She proposed a motion for a special election to replace the HOA president. The room buzzed with excitement. One board member quickly seconded the motion, clearly eager to save face. The vote was scheduled for the following month. Karen left without a word, no dramatic exit, just a stiff walk to her car. The damage was done. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood's mood shifted. People began swapping stories in driveways, sharing copies of the bylaws. The election became the talk of the block. I stayed mostly quiet, letting the tide carry itself, but I always answered questions with a calm smile and a reference to public records. When voting day arrived, it wasn't even close. Karen was out. A quieter, More level-headed board member took over and immediately passed a motion voiding every fine and warning she'd issued in the past 6 months. There was polite applause, but more than a few neighbors turned toward me, grinning.